She was a beautiful girl, young. I didn't know her, at all. But it's sad.
I'm going to address the coward. You know that my daughter was a force to be reckoned with. And I guarantee you that you will be reckoning with that force. Not only for the rest of your pathetic life, but for the rest of eternity as you burn in hell. My daughter was a big believer of karma. And as you could see, she's magical.
A piece of Karina Vetrano's tooth sat inside her killer's hand for 5 months. He didn't know it yet. Neither did anyone else. He walked into a hospital the day after her murder, told a doctor he'd gotten into some kind of altercation, had the fragment quietly removed. No one connected it to anything. 600 DNA samples came back with no match. 1,700 police reports led nowhere. 250 leads, dead-ended, one by one. The man responsible walked free, blocks from where he'd left her. What finally cracked the case wasn't a lab. It was one detective, refusing to let go of a stranger he'd noticed on his own street, months earlier, wearing a hooded tracksuit in 80-degree heat. Welcome to True Crime Case. 3 months before the murder, in late May of 2016, Lieutenant John Russo was standing on his own street in Howard Beach. He noticed a man walking away from him, one house over. It was 80 degrees. The man had a hood pulled up over his head. Russo thought, that's odd. The man seemed to be studying the houses around him. Russo called it in. By the time officers arrived, the man was gone. The next day, neighbors reported a similar figure cutting through yards. Russo found him again, close enough to ask his name. The man told him, Chanel Lewis. Russo made a note, moved on. Hold on to that name. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why a 5-second exchange on an ordinary afternoon ends up mattering more than almost anything else in this case. 3 months later, on August 2nd, 2016, 30-year-old Karina Vetrano took a photo of herself in her family's kitchen in Howard Beach, Queens. Her mother walked past in the background, not even glancing at the camera. It's the kind of photo taken 1,000 times a day. No one in it knew it would be the last picture ever taken of her alive. She stood barely 5 feet tall. People who knew her called her a firecracker, a laugh that filled up whatever room she was in. She held a master's degree from St. John's University and worked as a speech pathologist with children who had disabilities. On weekends, she catered and promoted in Astoria. She'd traveled widely and kept a blog where she once called life chaotic and unpredictable, but beautiful in its own small, poetic tragedies. She still lived at home, in a close-knit stretch of Queens tied deep to the nipped and effed-in-way. Running was her release. Most days, she ran with her father, Phil, a retired firefighter. That afternoon, his back was bothering him. He stayed home. At 5 o'clock, Karina laced up her shoes, told him not to worry, and turned toward Spring Creek Park. Nearly 2 square miles of federally protected marsh, weeds 10 feet high in places, blocks from her house. By 6:45, Phil hadn't heard from her. He called, nothing. Called again, still nothing. 2 hours gone. The quiet had turned into something else. He reached a friend on the force, and within minutes a patrol car was headed for Spring Creek. Officers searched, found nothing. So the search grew. More units, calling her name into weeds that swallowed sound whole. As night fell, more officers arrived. One detective on scene said you could feel the mood shift, until someone finally said it out loud. This doesn't feel good. At 10:30, officers heard a man screaming. It was Phil. He'd found his daughter 15 feet off the main trail, in a clearing neighbors had complained about for years. Officers had to pull him back physically. He wouldn't let her go. We cover cases like this one every week, the ones that only make sense when you slow all the way down. If that's what you're here for, stick around. What investigators found made clear this was no accident. Extensive injuries consistent with a violent struggle, and signs she'd fought for her life until the very end. An autopsy confirmed strangulation. There was also evidence of sexual assault, though the rape kit produced no usable DNA. What detectives did recover was DNA under her fingernails, and separately, on her cell phone, found 30 feet from her body. A profile, not a name. That profile went into CODIS. No match. The chief of detectives explained why. The database only went back to 1998. Anyone convicted before that, or never arrested at all, wouldn't show up. No eyewitnesses. A database dead end. This was now, literally, a search for a stranger. The response matched the scale of that problem. Federal land meant the FBI got involved, with drones and an industrial mower to clear the weeds. Detectives ruled out a homeless encampment, interviewed known sex offenders, and questioned people who slept rough in the park. 8 squads across Queens contributed to a dedicated task force. Every lead they pursued ended the same way. Nowhere. The chief of detectives called it a severe community threat and ordered a review of park patrols and cell tower analysis. Residents who'd walked those trails for decades were suddenly afraid of them. One neighbor told a local news crew she used to jog there every day. Now she was afraid to go outside at all. Investigators had raised one specific possibility publicly. This might not be someone Karina knew. 5 days later, a strange parallel. 27-year-old Vanessa Marcotte was found dead near her mother's home in Princeton, Massachusetts, after also going out for a run. For a while, 2 states compared notes. DNA proved the crimes weren't connected. New York investigators stuck with their theory. Random, and likely a stranger. On August 31st, working from a tip about a man in a wool cap near the scene, police released a composite sketch. Black male, 5'10", 35 to 45, medium build. "We have to speak to this person," the chief of detectives told reporters. The sketch produced a tip on a man we'll call Kevin, a former NIP chief working building security in Brooklyn, whose tenant resembled the composite closely. Officers questioned him. He refused to give DNA voluntarily. Detectives got a discarded water bottle instead. No match. Another dead end. In the months after the sketch went nowhere, Phil pushed for something called familial DNA searching, a technique that can identify relatives of an unknown suspect, even if the suspect himself isn't in any database. Already legal in 9 states, not in New York, Phil started a petition. Civil liberties groups pushed back, warning of what one group called miscarriages of justice. By early 2017, the case was cold in every conventional sense. So how does a case with over 2,000 dead ends suddenly break wide open? The answer had been sitting in a filing cabinet the entire time. In January 2017, Russo sat back down with the case file, and this time the memory that had sat quiet for 8 months started to itch. The hooded man, the 80-degree afternoon, the name given without hesitation. He pulled Chanel Lewis's record, no criminal history, but several old summonses, all tied to the Brooklyn side of Spring Creek Park, directly across from where Karina died. He called the chief of detectives. There was something in his voice on that call. On February 2nd, 2017, detectives brought Lewis in. He was cooperative from the start, describing himself as a loner who walked the trails to clear his head. He agreed to give DNA voluntarily. While the lab processed it, investigators dug into his past and found a documented troubled history going back to high school. Hospitalizations at 15 tied to threats toward classmates. Some former classmates remembered him as withdrawn and frequently bullied. Others said they'd never seen him act violently toward anyone. It's a complicated history, and no account of it offers one clean explanation. Then came a detail investigators didn't expect. offered up unknowingly by the one person most determined to see Lewis cleared. His father told detectives he'd personally driven Chanel to the hospital the day after the murder for a hand injury Lewis blamed on an unrelated altercation. But what was actually pulled out of his hand that day would turn out to be the one piece of evidence nobody had thought to look for. A DNA lab was about to do what months of task force work couldn't, and Chanel Lewis had no idea it was already over. Detectives found the treating physician, who confirmed removing a foreign object from Lewis's hand that day. Less than 24 hours later, the DNA results came back. A match, a profile so distinctive it would later be described in court as occurring in roughly 1 in 6.8 trillion people. The object pulled from his hand is now believed to have been a fragment of Karina's own tooth. Evidence, investigators say, of just how hard she fought back in her final moments. On February 5, 2017, detectives sat Lewis down for a recorded interview. He said he was alone in the park around 5, listening to music, when a woman passed him running. Something from an earlier, unrelated situation made him angry, he said. He grabbed her. Says he struck her repeatedly in a sudden burst of anger. He offered details investigators had never made public. He was arrested and charged with murder. His first trial began in November 2018 and ended in a mistrial when the jury couldn't reach a unanimous verdict. A second trial started in March 2019. Russo took the stand. Prosecutors laid out the DNA, the cell site data, the confession. On April 1st, 2019, a Queens jury found Chanel Lewis guilty on multiple counts, including first-degree murder, sentenced to life without parole. The case reopened one more time in 2023, not in a precinct, but in a courtroom. Reports had surfaced describing a controversial DNA phenotyping technique the NIPT used during the investigation, and the retention of DNA from hundreds of men in the area, disproportionately black men. Attorney Ronald Kuby filed a motion arguing his client had been the target of a racial dragnet. A Queens judge rejected it in February 2026, finding Lewis had been approached because of Russo's own memory, not any phenotyping report, and that Lewis and his mother had given voluntary, informed consent. The judge called the case against him overwhelming. Kuby says he'll appeal. What stays with you isn't really the forensics. It's the timing. A detective crossed paths with a killer on an ordinary afternoon, months before anyone died, and nearly let it slide into nothing. None of the department's resources worked. Not because they weren't thorough, but because the one thing that would have worked was standing on a street in Howard Beach the whole time. That's why this channel exists, to hand you the whole timeline, as a true crime documentary should, before it hands you the ending. And before you go, if Russo hadn't been standing on that street, that one afternoon, do you think this case ever gets solved? Tell me what you think.